welcome to this Meta Radio takeover, everybody. Today, I will be your host, and we will be talking all about personal tokens. So I am incredibly excited to have as a guest on our podcast, Elizabeth Renieris. Elizabeth, hello. Would you mind giving us a quick intro?
Hi, Simona. Yeah, thanks for having me. So quick intro on myself is I'm a data protection and privacy lawyer. A couple of years ago, I started a consultancy called Hacky Lawyer, which tries to bridge the gap between law, policy, and technology. I am also a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where I study data governance. And I've been in and out of the blockchain space for about the last 5 years or so. I worked in-house at 2 blockchain startups. And let's see, I'm also a tech and human rights fellow at the Carr Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I guess without further ado, let us dive into the tumultuous waters of personal tokens.
Yeah.
They are definitely having their time in the spotlight right now. So I thought we should dive into what's good, what's bad, what might be ugly. And I would love to get your take on them.
Yeah. So as you know, I have been less involved in the day-to-day of the cryptoverse in recent times, since, leaving sort of direct involvement in blockchain startups. And some of that is because I've had concerns about, the direction that some projects and communities have been taking. But I've certainly been keeping an eye on things and dipping a toe in and out here and there. Obviously have a lot of friends in the industry. And I too have been seeing this growing trend and seeing this idea of personal tokens popping up everywhere. And it's interesting. I actually first heard the notion back in 2017 when I was out in Palo Alto. A very well-known personality in the crypto space actually suggested that I ICO myself.
Okay.
In other words, have my own, token sale. And I suppose it was a precursor to this idea of a personal token. And of course, I completely dismissed the idea at the time. This was at the peak of companies and startups doing ICOs. And I also just, as a lawyer and abhorrent, and didn't really think it would go anywhere. And so it's been interesting to watch how this idea has really taken hold, as you say, and is actually a rather commonly suggested idea in many of the crypto circles.
I think the main kind of arguments for personal tokens are, the freedom to essentially be able to set a value for the time that you spend, or let's say the skills that you have, without necessarily needing a company to do that for you, or without necessarily needing an intermediary. And so for a lot of people, this shift that we are seeing with the future of work and blockchain being all about having, easier, more efficient ways of gaining value, of monetizing, and so on. From that angle, people are seeing it as a very, very beneficial mechanism. And so I would love to get your thoughts on, is it actually that on the surface, but in fact, in the actual substance of it, it has much broader, dare I say, nefarious connotations or implications?
Yeah, so I certainly understand where some of the proponents are coming from. And I certainly understand that there are many people who are well-intentioned with this idea and are, like you said, looking for a way to, increase kind of inclusion and expand access. And they're looking for a way to build a more participatory system and give people certain opportunities. I think the concern is that there is a very good public policy reason to be concerned about this, which is, I'll give you a really straightforward example. So, at least under US law, if you're a sole proprietor, as I am, for example, if you're a single member entity, if you're even a partnership, as a matter of law, we don't allow sole proprietors to sell stock in their sole proprietorship, because it's not a corporation and it's not a legal entity, but it is wrapped up and inextricable from their personal identity. And as a matter of public policy, we don't think it's acceptable to have anyone have an ownership stake in your personal identity, which is why we require somebody who's interested in, let's say, legitimately interested in raising money for, themselves or their own project. We require them to go through this step of creating a legal abstraction, of creating a company structure that can accommodate the sort of ownership interests of others, to create a separation and a distance between one's personal identity and between something that is subject to the ownership of other people. And certainly, I think having this conversation on Juneteenth and recognizing the significance of this day in America from the perspective of, emancipation and the end of slavery in many ways, I think it's really critical that we don't lose sight of the history of why, from a public policy perspective and from a moral perspective, we should be concerned about this idea of anyone having an ownership stake in a personal identity of an individual.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think with that, of course, comes, what are the use cases for personal tokens, right? Because like you very rightly mentioned, it opens up so many different avenues and so many different, again, potentially negative use cases for these personal tokens, like let's say cancel culture, right? And what does that mean when a person who, let's say, booked some time and they're not satisfied with the advice that you have given them, with the service that you have given them, want to leave a bad review or get a refund? What implications does that have as a token holder of your token in the broader digital realm of reputation, of, people having a stake in your persona? Like, how far could you push that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the concern, is that, could you compel someone to do something, or to direct their attention in some way, or to, direct their behavior in some way? Could you and should you be able to compel someone because you now have taken, some kind of ownership stake in the outcome of their behavior or their attention or their activity? And I think what's really concerning about this is that it feels like, all of the vulnerabilities and shortcomings and problems we've seen in the gig economy taken to the extreme. And so we've seen how in the gig economy, there has been a real exploitation of workers. There has been a real, because gig workers are not treated as employees, because they are not, they don't have the benefits that employees would, whether it's labor protections or, the sort of social protections. They're now obviously, in many cases, gig workers are starting to organize, they're starting to unionize. And I think the pandemic has really exposed the fragility of gig workers, who do so much of the critical work in our economy, and are starting to realize that without the sort of protections of some kind of legal relationship there to actually extend, those protections to those individuals, they're very much left, hanging out to dry. And I think my concern with the personal tokens is that it just feels like further cementing this paradigm that, though perhaps well-intentioned in some instances, is not only subject to, all of the shortcomings of the gig economy, but now on top is subject to these ethical and moral concerns around compelling the behavior of other people. And I think I recently saw an example of, someone talking about smart contracts enforced through neurohacking or neuroprogramming. And this idea that, if you had a personal stake or personal or equity interest in someone's personal token, that you could then use some kind of, neuro hacking, smart contract enforced technology to compel an outcome or a behavior, which again, I think many of us should find extremely alarming. I certainly do myself.
Yeah, that's I saw that as well. I think you shared that tweet. And I think like that's taking it a little bit further than what we have seen so far, right? So far we've seen the personal tokens being used for, hey, buy my token and you can fly with me, or you can vote on how I spend my time. So I think Alex recently, with his token, Alex basically opened up the very first vote on 4 things that he should do, like wake up at 6 a.m., reduce his consumption of red meat, jog for I don't know how many miles, and so on. So pretty benign, let's say, applications, if you will. What do we feel is that the danger is that we start with that and then it just keeps creeping and creeping and creeping? And is there an instance where this control over what people can vote on because they hold your token, can the token holder actually control all of that? And in fact, it can be kept within these very benign limits.
I think one thing we have to point out is, you and I are both well aware of the real deficiencies in terms of diversity of perspectives in many of these communities. And frankly, I think that's where some of the naive approaches are stemming from. I've seen mostly these ideas being pushed by, white males, typically young white males, with very limited context of, again, the reasons that we have certain public policy decisions in place around separation of, personhood and corporate personhood, around, legal entities and vehicles. I think we have to be aware that people are often not contextualizing these things, and to them, given their sort of limited context, some of this does seem benign, and it seems well-intentioned, as I said. And this is often how really dystopian technologies emerge, right, is through the best of intentions, but in a context where they're built by people with extremely limited context and a very narrow perspective. And you can see how quickly something like this gets weaponized against those with, less power and less privilege, with those who have more financial need and perhaps are not doing this out of choice, right, but are now compelled to to sell themselves effectively. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. And so my concerns are always around, and my thinking always goes to, what is the sort of weaponization of this technology or this structure or this tool? And, as I said, it does, you don't have to walk very far down that path to see how catastrophic this could be for certain individuals and communities.
Mm. So do you feel this could rapidly, let's say, gain momentum and get to a point where we do have a very high popularity of personal tokens that can then potentially become the norm and then get us into these situations that we are just clearly not thinking about right now?
Yeah, that's a tough one. As you know, I'm sort of very interdisciplinary myself and cut across different domains and different communities. And, I thankfully haven't really seen this spilling over into those other communities or domains or the mainstream as yet. That being said, a lot of things in the crypto community do spill out into the mainstream in unforeseeable ways. And sometimes those tipping points are very uncertain. So for example, I think this idea around blockchain-enabled COVID immunity passports, which obviously I've spoken out against, kind of quickly spilled out into the mainstream through a series of accidents. And so I do worry that there could be a similar tipping point here where, again, something born out of a very narrow and limited and perhaps naive and well-intentioned context is kind of misunderstood and transposed into a broader context where it's completely ill-suited and, has all this nefarious potential. Again, as a matter of law and policy, because we have this sort of basic principle against, ownership of shares or stock in people, I'm not exactly sure how how it could take hold. I am sure there are probably crypto lawyers interested in working on this sort of thing, but I view it as my kind of ethical obligation to challenge any headway made there.
Do you think there are potentially, I'm wondering if there are, aside the US, like outside of the US, do we feel that is easier to do legally? I mean, I know that potentially you're not proficient in full international law across all countries, but have you ever come across certain regions or certain countries that would enable a legal dynamic that would fast forward this or enable this much easier than the US?
I guess two things to say on that. The first is that I think it's going to be hard to get around core principles of international human rights law.
Okay.
There are some real fundamental constraints there around, for example, the prohibition against slavery is not a derogable right. There are no exceptions, right? And so there can be certainly situations in which, that's one human right that may be implicated, and certainly rights around autonomy. But I think the more practical reality is, if we, you and I've obviously been at this a long time, if we look at just the similar trajectory that, that ICOs took, kind of morphing into STOs, I think people are going to see potentially, if they pursue this idea of, personal token, my prediction is it will inevitably morph into a conversation about what's the legal vehicle and what is the legal action and structure that allows people to effectively crowdfund themselves or their own project without actually selling themselves. And I think, like I said, just like we saw this with ICOs, where actually having a lack of a legal structure that aligns with the reality of law and policy ultimately wasn't a sustainable position, and it forced this kind of evolutionary path into what is a more mainstream legal framework, if you will. And I think the reason for that is, again, the context that's lost in many of these communities, which can be quite insular, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement and collaboration, which is all wonderful. And as it's one of the things I love about the Ethereum community is just the enthusiasm. But I think what happens sometimes you get into these echo chambers where you lose that perspective of there's a reason why for centuries, over centuries, we've evolved to have these very fundamental principles of law and policy, and they're there for good reason, and we've gone through these cycles before. And I think we're in a similar cycle here with personal tokens, where it feels new and it feels exciting, and there's a lot of technical experimentation, and there are these, as you say, benign kind of test cases, and people are just really excited in a way because it feels like a novelty. But I think in time we will see, if you take the logic a couple of steps further, again, it doesn't take long to get back to the basic principles that kind of are the reason we prohibit these things in the first place. And so, maybe that's an important evolution that has to happen. Maybe other interesting experimentation comes out of it. Maybe there are other ways to, approach crowdfunding. Maybe there are other ways to approach the gig economy. And, I think that can all be valuable experimentation. I just, because of my sort of very interdisciplinary background and having, worked in multiple areas of the law in different countries, my sense around this is that we're going to see that kind of inevitable arc of, around the evolution of the legal structure for something like this.
That makes a lot of sense. And from there, because we've been chatting about communities, do you feel, because again, this is another piece, there's a lot of enthusiasm around, and there's a lot of, applications for community tokens. What's your view on those, and how, let's say, more inclusive or better are they better than personal tokens? Do they enable people to take this idea of transacting value at a community level, but in a much let's say, safer way? Is there a view on that, or any kind of, let's say, are there any legal implications on community tokens?
Well, I think it's the same idea as to whether you can create a separation between the people involved in these communities and then activities that you would want to subject to a market structure or an ownership structure. And I think fundamentally it comes back to the same principle of, there's a good reason. And, it's not just a reason imposed, externally by law and policy, but it's a reason that people should really perhaps reflect on, themselves as to why it's good to have this separation, if you will. So I think, the community idea isn't necessarily any different if the community is just construed as, made up of a bunch of individuals who are now effectively pooling their time or pooling their, resources and then redistributing that. I think what we'll find is, that's sort of what the corporation is for in many ways, is to have that redistribution and to be able to, raise money in certain ways and be able to have, capital flowing through a corporation without having to have that direct linkage to people and their own inherent worth or identity. So, I mean, it's an interesting evolution to watch. And I think what's been interesting for me is seeing kind of the fundamental questions that, come up time and time again, re-evaluated and reintroduced. And then, perhaps each time there's some more insights that we glean. But I think there is something fundamentally about human nature and about the nature of collaboration and communities and society where, we take different routes to get to the same path often. So, I guess I would say I'm personally skeptical that those are any better. They feel a little bit more protective in the sense that there is not this one-to-one equating of identity with, ownership. And they also feel like, there might be some protection in the community dynamic, but I think ultimately the protection comes from saying, I as an individual or we as a group of individuals, cannot be owned, right? Cannot be sold, cannot be traded, and all of the many things that, again, stem from a very fundamental basic principles of sort of human rights and public policy.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's the main, I guess, balance that we need to strike between having this peer-to-peer, very direct interaction or ability to transact value and that protection that that's been baked in for reasons, right? That have evolved and have gotten us to this point. And I think sometimes we do have that, certainly because we want to remove intermediaries and we want to make everything a lot more direct and a lot more, peer-to-peer. I think there is potentially that tendency of just going, okay, let's strip everything and just go very, very direct. Whereas certain protections do need to be there for all of these reasons that you've mentioned. And that we know, but somehow aren't necessarily thinking of them when we create these experiments. Because I think at this stage, that's what they are, right?
Exactly. And I think that's the value of really opening up the community, diversifying, whose perspectives are part of these conversations. Because, if you're lacking perspectives from all sides, from, in terms of gender or race or age or geography, I think they're just going to be blind spots, that just keep showing up in the experimentation. And I think that, I do think there are limits to disintermediation. And I think this is one area where the crypto community, does go in circles sometimes, that this idea of full disintermediation isn't actually that protective or liberating. I mean, for many people that, particularly those who are more vulnerable, particularly minority groups, women, people in certain countries, intermediaries, institutions, things like that, do play a fundamentally protective role, as they do in the crypto community. I think many of the things that we take for granted, the property structures that many people advocate for, only exist because, as a matter of law policy, we have sanctioned them and we have institutions that back them. So I think, I think, as I said, there certainly are insights that might come out of this, but I think fundamentally, I find the idea, again, particularly having this conversation on Juneteenth, I think, adding, broadening the perspective of the communities doing this experimentation and really thinking about the historical context and the fundamental rights implications, I think people will hopefully see the real dangers of personal tokens.
Okay. That again is common sense, right? It's or not necessarily common sense, but I think, like you say, it's very important to make sure that we are aware of everything that has come before and don't just approach things almost from a completely clean slate when we don't have, right? It's has this huge implication that has evolved, and rightfully so. Just because we're nearing our time, what would be your main advice or main word of caution? I mean, we've been talking about words of caution, but just in terms of experimentation, right? Because I don't think that's going to stop. I think we are going to still have this experimentation until we get to a place where we learn some things or change some things and continue to evolve it or shape it or try to learn from the mistakes that we made or make or learn from all of the different experiments. What would be your main piece of advice?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think my main piece of advice would be to bring others in. I don't think there's any other way around it. I think the community needs to come to terms with its own limitations. I think, certainly the work that everyone's trying to do now around anti-racism, I think is critical. I think trying to consciously take some time to step out of the echo chambers and to, dip a toe into another field or another perspective, broadening those viewpoints, I think will go a long way to adding the context that's really necessary to, because there are, as I said, there are some real good intentions here. I think there are people who, are doing this because they, like I said, they want to broaden access and opportunity. But I think without really situating that in a broader social, historical, political context, they're probably undoing their own good intentions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful, and I think again, it's definitely not a call to stop experimentation, but rather to really do it with, like you say, with a broader context in mind, and taking all of those different perspectives into consideration when mapping this out, because it's the only way we are potentially going to construct viable alternatives to what we have right now without, taking us, putting us in a place where we regress rather than progress. Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And, to those who are working on these tokens and these projects, I'm always here as a resource and, happy to weigh in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for listening.